Paul's letter to the Galatians is such an interesting letter because of the tenor and tone of the letter. Nearly every letter attributed to Paul begins with warm greetings to the members of the church to which he's writing, because, for the most part, he knows the members of each church. He has a personal relationship with them. But in Galatians, Paul's tone is anything but warm. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Monday, January 26th, 2026. The first 5 verses of Galatians include boilerplate language that would be included in any letter. It identifies the writer and the recipient, just as a letter we would write would contain a return address containing who the letter's from and an address on the front of the envelope indicating who the recipient of the letter is. Paul also includes an apostolic greeting, much the same way we would say "Dear so-and-so," only Paul is more formal. "Grace to you and peace" is how he usually puts it. After these formalities, Paul ordinarily engages in what you might think of as introductory small talk, language intended to remind the recipients of the good feelings that exist between both of them. For example, in Philippians, Paul begins the body of the letter by saying, "I thank my God every time I remember you." That is warm, affectionate language. And in Colossians, he begins the body of the letter in much the same way, saying, "In our prayers for you, we always thank God." So it is jarring the way Paul opens the body of the letter to the Galatians. Here's what he says: "I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ." Not exactly warm and fuzzy. But let's listen to the context here because it is most illuminating. Paul writes, "I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel." Not that there is another gospel, but there are some who are confusing you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. "But even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what we proclaim to you, let that one be accursed. As we have said before, so now I repeat, if anyone proclaims to you a gospel contrary to what you received, let that one be accursed. Am I now seeking human approval or God's approval? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still pleasing people, I would not be a servant of Christ." So, if you've been listening to my daily devotionals for any time at all, you've probably heard me describe in broad outlines the situation faced by many of the churches to which Paul wrote. There were itinerant preachers traveling around that part of the world, spreading the gospel message. But we know from other writings that didn't make it into the Bible, and from some of the early church fathers, that there were versions of the gospel floating around that weren't, shall we say, kosher. Some of these writings had been lost for nearly 2,000 years, until fragments of some of them were discovered in Egypt about 75 years ago. Until then, the only information we had about them was contained in writings like Paul's, references without quotes. Now that we have some of these ancient writings, it is clear that there were a lot of alternative gospels floating around, and at some point the church had to decide which were authentic and which were false or error-filled. This letter to the Galatians gives us a glimpse behind the curtain, so to speak, to see how the church decided which preachers were preaching the authentic Christian gospel and which were preaching a flawed gospel. So tomorrow I'll describe how Paul discerned the true from the false. For now, it's important just to know that the church has always been faced with differences about what constitutes the true faith from the false. There has never been a time in the history of the church when everyone, everywhere, agreed on everything. Let me say that again, because it is a little bracing. There has never been a time when everyone, everywhere, agreed on everything about the faith. What that means for us is that, like every generation, we have to make our own way through life, doing our best to discern what is true, certain that we sometimes get it wrong, but also confident in God's mercy to nudge us back on the right track. If that makes you a little nervous, well, maybe that's not a bad thing. To quote Paul from his letter to the Philippians, "Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for his good pleasure." Today we've seen that Paul identified the issue of false gospels floating around the church. Tomorrow we'll ask the question, on what basis does Paul claim to know the true gospel from false teachings? But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.